But there was one prisoner who, because of his psychological and psychiatric condition, which I think was not psychopathy, but might have been a bit of psychopathy mixed with psychosis. So he's also, just really disturbed grip on reality. He was given by an angel the message that he had to kill a certain number of people in order to bring back his dead son. So he went on a bit of a spree to build up to that particular number. And he didn't get to that number, but he was well on the way to it by the time I saw him.
I didn't go to my son's funeral in the sense of going. 3 months later, I went down to his grave. I was on angel dust, PCP as it's known, and I hallucinated, and my son come back in a light, and he was about 19, 18 years old, and he said, "Dad, kill 7 people and I'll come back to life." Within half an hour, there was 1 person killed on the grave.
Actually in the cemetery?
Yes.
So, did you kill 7 people?
No comment on that.
I'm Amelia Saw and this is Twisted Minds, a podcast about what makes criminals tick and the people who dedicate their lives to finding out. David Mutton is a forensic psychologist with a difference. He learned his craft in Parramatta Jail in the 1980s, a prison that became famous for its notoriously dangerous inmates. Then he became the chief psychologist for the New South Wales Police. It was his job to keep the undercover cops on the straight and narrow, to help them remember they were cops pretending to be criminals, and not the other way around.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in a country town for about the first 7 years called Crookwell near Goulburn, then moved to the Parramatta district, and I stayed there until my late 20s and then sort of moved on after that. So basically a bit of a Westie for a large part of my life, and a bit of a country boy right at the beginning too. So
you left school, you thought, I want to study psychology?
Yes and no. I did start that, and then I did think that, and then, would you believe it, I got good marks, so I started medicine at Sydney Uni, and then after that first year I thought, why am I doing this? Because I don't really want to be a doctor, because I came from a medical family. I want to be a psychologist, which is what I wanted to be at school. So I went into arts the next year, and then did my psychology degree after that.
And so you finished psychology. I'm assuming you were in your early 20s, young, fresh-eyed. I'm going to, assume you're a nice country boy, and you think, I might go and sit down with people who've done terrible things.
I was desperate for work. It was because I was around the Parramatta district. I was offered some volunteer work at Parramatta Jail through connections. So I took it up for 6 months, and then after that I got a quote proper job within the correctional system there. But that first 6 months just happened to be by chance. So I wasn't thinking about big bad people or danger or murders or anything like that. I just happened to land at Parramatta Jail when that was actually probably at its height.
Wow. So what year was that? Would it have been?
No, mid-1980.
Parramatta was medium to maximum, is that right?
It was the worst of the maximum. So a lot of the heavies of the system were there, if not Goulburn, Parramatta.
These days, Parramatta Jail is no longer in use. But in the 1980s, the prison was a formidable presence, famous for housing some of Australia's toughest crims. It was a sandstone building surrounded by steel bars and covered in barbed wire. A hotbed of rapists, murderers, violent bikies and armed robbers. And David showing up as a volunteer psychologist on his first day of work.
This was in the 80s, before there was high-tech electronic security, so it's all padlocks and keys and prison officers and things like that. So the first day I remember, it was winter time, so it was a bit chilly. And Parramatta Jail is probably one of the oldest jails in the system. So people go to Port Arthur and they go to Norfolk Island to visit jails. Well, guess what? Parramatta Jail is of that same era there. So I was working in a kind of a archaeological relic to a large extent. And that was interesting in its own right, even physically walking around, looking at those old-fashioned wings and sandstone and things like that. It was a cold day, and I was shaking like a leaf, literally. And I remember I was wondering, am I cold or am I really anxious? And I really think it was both. And I think if anyone had seen me, they would have literally seen me shaking luckily.
Was that a bit daunting as a young man?
Not really, because I was quite naive. So in the sense that I wasn't even aware that the people I was talking to had that reputation, because in conversations they come across pretty normally. And I think that's the thing that most people don't understand, is that 90% of probably people who are in jail are, quotes, normal like the rest of us. So, they have the same sorts of thoughts and feelings. They get angry, they fall in love, they get hungry, all the normal things. And they can carry on a very interesting conversation. You could be mesmerised by them for hours, which is sometimes part of their technique. You've got to be careful that sometimes they're very good at working on you. And so you could have some fantastic conversations with them. The worst people, quotes, the worst people, the worst crimes, the more engaging they tend to be, because they've got something to talk about.
This idea that is probably, and I will put myself in it here, perpetuated by the media, that people in prison, people who've committed, say, murdered their whole family or serial rapists, or all these crimes that we think are just so mortifying that none of us could ever relate to, and they're kind of framed in the media as monsters, like the worst of the worst, so evil that, I'm doing a really bad American accent now, so evil that we would, never, they're not human, they're not like us. But you're saying that's not actually the case when you get to know them.
Not at all. As I said, 90% of them are, quotes, like us, normal. Perhaps that 10% that's not like us is quite a potent 10% and can really drive them to do things that are way out of the normal. But unless those factors are in operation at the time, then that other 90% is there. So in other words, you know what I mean? It's just that they're normally there 90% of the time. It's only when the buttons are pushed somehow, either through anger or inability to control addictions or inability to control emotions or poor communications or greed or whatever motivation there presses those buttons, then they'll go that extra distance. But the rest of the 90% of the time, you'll be sitting beside them perhaps on a bus, and you won't know the difference.
It's fascinating to think that the most ordinary types of people can commit extraordinary acts of violence, and how devastating that 10% of not normal can be when it comes out.
There was one in particular which wasn't particularly a big headline case, but it was a case of a man who was in a relationship with a woman, had a child, and the relationship broke up, and the woman was going to take the child. So his reasoning was, if I can't have the child, you can't either. So he smothered the child. I think it was just a little toddler at the time, so had no way of being able to fight back. So his rationalisation, his thought process at the time, and even when I was talking to him, was, she was trying to take the child from me, I took the child from her in the only way I could. And so often with the people we talk to, even though that 90% is normal, it's that 10% of their way they think about things often which is the difference. So how they can rationalise, justify, argue, explain to themselves and the world why they did what they did. And that's the part that the psychologists try to address. It's the cognitive part that's going inside their heads. And we think that there might be, with some cases, a neurological basis. So in other words, perhaps their frontal lobe, which is in us, is the part that controls our emotions and gives us sort of conscience, may be a bit lacking, either through injury, drug overdoses, or just through their birth. And so that's why they perhaps act in that what we call irrational way, but in their case quite rational, but without conscience and without empathy. So they're not thinking about how others might feel, they're just totally thinking about how I am feeling at the time. That's probably one of the major differences, I think, that defines that 10%. But you won't know that just by talking to someone casually.
That's really interesting and maybe a little bit alarming, because it means that any of us could go about everyday life and perhaps, strike up a conversation with a stranger in a cafe, have a perfectly pleasant conversation, or walking the dog, meet someone. And there would, I suppose, to someone who's not trained, or perhaps even to a trained person, there might not be any indication that this person could do something that's pretty kind of horrific.
That's quite so, because if you read the newspapers, there's a lot of con people out there, usually con men, who are really good at what they do. And they've sucked in top business people, top politicians, people who've got brains and sense. But because they're so good at what they do, everyone's vulnerable. Now, what I'm going to say is that the dumb ones are in prison. The smart ones are in business and politics. And so therefore, there's probably a lot of people out there who are functioning quite well in society, who have this cognitive problem, who have this lack of conscience, who have diminished frontal lobes, who are doing quite well because they're probably a bit smarter and they know how to avoid getting into trouble. The dumb ones who don't think ahead are in jail.
So when you talked about this frontal lobe, and you mentioned those things that might cause this kind of these problems, the lack of empathy, the kind of, focus on just serving their own needs. Is that what people colloquially refer to as a psychopath?
Yes, it is. It's got lots of other names. I mean, technically, you could talk about antisocial personality disorders and dissocial personalities and other things, but there's a whole brand of study now, which has come out in the last 20, 30 years, focusing on psychopathy. And they think it is probably neurological. And it really, the main feature is that they're persuasive, charming, glib, superficial, without any conscience, without any empathy, and probably without any loyalty even. So in other words, they'll sell their own family to follow their own ends.
Can you treat a psychopath?
Probably up until 20, 30 years ago, there was a lot of psychiatrists, psychologists who said no. And so if they diagnose someone with a severe psychopathy, they pretty much say throw away the key for sentencing or for parole. Say, don't let them out because they're unchanged, unchangeable and dangerous. But through study and research, there have been some successful outcomes.
Have you sat down with a serial killer?
Yes, I'm sat down with we think they're serial killers because a lot of the time it was assumed they had killed people, but sometimes it was very hard to pin them exactly. And that was when I was working in Parramatta Jail, where there are actually some prison deaths. And we think it was one particular prisoner. And I've got to be careful now talking about specifics, but there was one prisoner who, because of his psychological and psychiatric condition, which I think was not psychopathy, but might have been a bit of psychopathy mixed with psychosis. So he's also just really disturbed grip on reality. He was given by an angel the message that he had to kill a certain number of people in order to bring back his dead son. So he went on a bit of a spree to build up to that particular number. And he didn't get to that number, but he was well on the way to it by the time I saw him.
David wouldn't be drawn about the identity of the prisoner, but the convicted serial killer's story is well known. He was even interviewed on a UK television chat show in 2011. Here's what he said about the bizarre forces that led him to kill.
I didn't go to my son's funeral in the sense of going. 3 months later I went down to his grave. I was on angel dust, PCP as it's known, and I hallucinated, and my son come back in a light, and he was about 19, 18 years old, and he said, "Dad, kill 7 people and I'll come back to life." Within half an hour there was 1 person killed on the grave.
Actually in the cemetery?
Yes.
So did you kill 7 people?
No comment on that.
So that's where you get the interaction of the psychopathy, which is probably there, and probably psychosis, where they are, they're quite deluded in their thinking. The media often portrays dangerous people as psychotics, the mad person that, with the glittery eyes and things like that. Most people in prison aren't at that level. There's certainly a lot with mental illness, but it's more like depression and anxiety and, really garden variety kind of psychological conditions. So it's very rare to get that psychopathy and psychosis mix there, and that can be really potent, and that's probably the kind of the monster kind of movie material, those people. But they're very, very rare in prison. In fact, when psychiatrists and psychologists get one of them, they get quite excited.
When you sit down with someone, who might have committed a very violent crime, how do you kind of relate to these people, or at least make them feel relaxed enough to be able to, hopefully talk quite openly with you?
Yeah. It's what you're doing to me now. In other words, you show interest. You just use counselling 101 techniques of, paying attention, being interested, focusing on the person rather than on your agenda, showing empathy. In other words, sort of understanding that they're feeling something, so trying to connect with that empathy. Not being judgmental, obviously, because where they come from, there's a lot of judgment. Where they come from, no one pays any attention to them. So to get half an hour of someone's undivided attention is rare in ordinary life. I mean, think of the last time anyone gave you an hour's attention, just to you. Very rare. So that usually gets a lot of people to open up, unless they've got real barriers or they've been through psychologists and psychiatrists before and had bad experiences. Then they won't answer, or they are suspecting your motivation for wanting to find stuff out. I remember there was one person, he'd just come into Parramatta Jail for murder, and he was really hyped up at the time, and another prisoner who I'd been seeing brought him along to see me, and he sat with him, which is not usual, but I guess that was the only way this prisoner was going to sit with me. And I kept asking just ordinary interview type questions, and after about 15, 20 minutes, he says, I just can't cope with this anymore. And then the other prisoner who just helped him come to me came back to me later, said, David, you don't realise how close you were for this guy just decking you, because he just thought that you were intruding, you were trying to find stuff out, that you were really being too personal, when I wasn't, but in his state at that time, he just misperceived or misconstrued or mistrusted everything that was happening. So I thought, oh, all right, thank you for letting me know.
Has there been any situations where you have either been threatened or someone's losing their temper around you and you felt quite scared? Or
a couple of times when, yet again, in the consultation room, and there were prison officers outside, but there's no prison officers inside, and they can't hear or really sort of see what's going on. One prisoner, I think he must have been drunk on home brew. They brew up a concoction there, which is probably quite alcoholic and probably quite poisonous too. And there was some issue with his family. He wanted to see them or wanted to communicate with them. We just couldn't give him that access. And I think he came to me asking me for a phone call, and I said, no, I can't. So he started thumping the desk and then punching the walls, and then he tried to get out of the room, but there was two locks on the door. There's an old lock and a modern one that they'd put there, and he tried the old lock, which didn't work, and so he couldn't actually open the door, and he was getting agitated. It's a small glass pane in the door, about a foot by foot by foot. So he just put his fist through that, and then of course that cut him quite badly, and then suddenly blood was spraying all around the room. And then prison officers obviously came, they got him and dragged him away. And I realised at that time two things: don't have anything on your desk that could be used as a weapon. And secondly, and this is where a big mistake was, my position in relation to the door and the desk. There was door, desk, David, or door, prisoner, desk, David. Not a good way of positioning yourself if you need some help. And so my tactic at that point was to go small and quiet. So that it's sort of like animals in nature, if they're under threat, just sort of become kind of small and unimposing. Well, that was me. My physical nature took over, and it worked.
After David left Parramatta Men's Jail, he worked at Mullowa Women's Prison. These weren't genteel, tea-sipping ladies. A lot of these women were just as tough as the men, if not tougher.
Yes, Mullowa, and in those days, was quite a small prison. I think there was probably anywhere between 100 and 150, maybe 200 prisoners of females in the system maximum, out of about 5,000 or 6,000 other prisoners, men mostly. So it was quite a small, little, intimate prison. And as a psychologist there, I was the first male psychologist in that environment. And I don't know whether that was an experiment on me or an experiment on them, but we survived, both of us, all of us. And part of the role there was to be the chair of the Mothers and Babies Committee. So that related to women who were pregnant while they're in custody. They came in pregnant, of course. And then they were having their babies, and a decision had to be made whether to be able to keep their baby in custody, or they might have to go outside and stay in a halfway house with their baby in the community there on licence, or to be separated from their baby. And of course, if they had really small sentences, then they would probably be, allowed to get the licence. It was sort of like a not quite so serious offence, and they were kind of, quotes, good prisoners, then they might be able to keep their baby in a little unit within the prison system. But in most cases, if they were not considered, quotes, good prisoners, or a long sentence, or they're maximum security, violent, what have you, and they're going to stay a long time in jail, they would have to surrender their babies, often to a mother or a sister or a relative. And you can imagine that would create quite a lot of angst amongst these women. And it's very hard to make those decisions too, but, I guess that's just the reality of life. They did what they did, but they were pregnant. It doesn't actually dissolve what they did in terms of criminal justice problem. Sorry. Criminal justice issues.
That is so difficult, isn't it? It's such a difficult, as you said, such a difficult decision to have to make, and to then, I imagine, counsel them through. How long would the children stay in custody with them? Until they were toddlers, or how did that work?
It was hopefully only for a very short time, maybe a matter of months, because the other issue is that they didn't want children to grow up in custody, because that's not good for them either. So it's almost like that's not normal life. So it's probably somewhat better maybe if they had a foster situation, or a parent, or a grandparent, or an auntie, or something like that. That still might be better. But a lot of these prisoners didn't have really functional people in their lives that they could surrender their children to. So docs or facs, or what it was called in those days, would probably have to take over as well. There were also talks that sometimes the prisoners, if they were starting to arc up about something, would use the children like a barrier. So in other words, if the prison officer had to come in and break things up, then the kids would be there like a shield. And so that was considered not to be a good thing, to have children put in the line of fire. I don't mean literal line of fire, but, in terms of security situations like that. So there was always probably a preference not to have children there for a long time.
Sometimes that meant David had to make some hard decisions. And he wasn't always popular as a result.
There was one in particular I remember where she was in for quite serious stuff. She'd been in and out of prison a lot, so she was quite a security risk. So if we put her into the community with her baby, she'd probably be doing drugs or committing crimes, as soon as she possibly could. So on those judgments about her risk, we said no, that the baby is to probably go with a relative, I think, at that point in time. And because within this prison, the small prison where our office was right in the centre of the prison, and people could come and go without any kind of security. So she came and she said to me, for what you've done, my boyfriend, partner, what have you, works with, it wasn't Telstra in those days, it was Telecom. He works with Telecom, and he can find out where you live. And you better watch it. And I felt like saying it to her at the time, don't put him to that trouble. Just look in the phone book, because I was there. And after that date, for the next edition of the telephone book, I gave myself a silent number. And that was probably something I should have done years before. But you do become quite blasé. And I think that's the risk. As you said, how do you feel going into these environments with all these violent, dangerous people? You actually normalise to it to such an extent that you can forget that you are in those environments, and it just becomes another day at the office. People who've killed 3 or 4 people just become your kind of, you have a cup of tea with them and have a chat.
After almost a decade, David got tired of sitting down to tea with mass murderers and took a job as the chief psychologist with the New South Wales Police.
Psychology section in the police started in the late 80s, and I started in 1990. So when I was there, psychology within the police was very, very new. And that surprises a lot of people, because when you sort of look at American television shows, there's always the psych there, telling them what to do and giving them all that insights that the dumb cops don't have. But really what happened in the late 80s, there was such an increase in sick leave, in permanent disability, in post-traumatic stress, which was just at that time becoming a feature, because of the Vietnam veterans were sort of coming through 10, 20 years after the war. And a lot of emergency service workers were also getting post-traumatic stress disorder. It was becoming really costly in terms of sick leave, in terms of permanent disability, pensions, that I think they thought the psychologists would be the magic bullets. Perhaps that's not a good image to use amongst police, but the magic key. That if we could then counsel them, they wouldn't get post-traumatic stress disorder, or if they had post-traumatic stress disorder, we could give them treatment so they become cured and go back to work.
David was also tasked with helping with recruitment to make sure those who joined the force were psychologically strong enough to take on the job.
So there was also trying to set up psychological screenings that would make sure that the people who were coming into the organisation were resilient enough. And we started at the pointy end. We didn't start at the recruit end, but we started at the specialist end. So there were people like undercover officers, child mistreatment officers, police rescue, surveillance people, state protection group, all the ones that were dealing with high-risk events every day as part of their work. And they likewise, a lot of them were falling like flies as well. So we started a selection process where we would give them psychological screening tests, but also interview them as well to sort of talk about their lives and to get a picture about how they cope, why they're coping, why they want to be in this section for a start. And so I don't know how successful we were, but I guess these are very early days. So I suppose that was an organisational approach to managing stress. In other words, not dealing with it once it happens, but trying to prevent it by building a resilient service. Since then, though, the police figures on stress and trauma haven't got any better, and I just think that's less to do with psychologists and probably more to do with that's just the way of the nature of organisations these days. People aren't willing just to stew in their own juices and cope, but they'll take action with the organisation or workers' compensation or something.
I think culturally as well, now we all know there's something called PTSD, and people are quite aware of things like workplace bullying and mental health, whereas even 10 years ago, or 15, they were kind of less accepted as things that just socially even, now I think someone could say, oh, look, so-and-so's on mental health leave, and it would be quite acceptable, whereas I think 15 years ago, just thinking about if someone said, oh, they're on mental health leave, you kind of falsely assume, oh, they must be crazy. It just wasn't as accepted.
That's absolutely true, and it's certainly within the police, in a very male-dominated force, of course, at that time, and still is, I suppose, where you would be stigmatised by having a mental health issue. So a lot of them cope by drinking excessively. So risky drinking levels were probably at least 50%. Alcoholism was probably, I don't know what the percentages were, but risky, you know what I mean by risky. In other words, you would be advised by a health professional to slow down. So that's how they often dealt with it, in multiple marriages and things like that. We were almost blamed for creating the culture because we probably lowered the stigma, and as a result, therefore, more people came forward. And therefore, from an organisational perspective, they were saying, we've hired you psychologists to stem the flow, and it's getting more and more. And I used to say, well, we've probably given them the language now to be able to express what they're going through. And I suppose they were damaged one way or the other, so it's probably better that they kind of left or got into treatment or went into a psychiatric hospital and got treated than just to be dangerous, because I guess you've got an unstable police officer. You, as a member of the community, are at risk. Because don't forget, they can arrest you, they can restrain you, they can shoot you. So everyone in the community has a vested interest that their cops are mentally healthy.
One area that particularly needed David's guidance was the undercover unit. The concept of going undercover is something most of us are familiar with, from the original James Bond to the hit 1980s Beverly Hills Cop movies. It's an idea that Hollywood just can't get enough of. But what's it really like? Did the ridiculous antics that Eddie Murphy got up to in the Beverly Hills Cop movies really happen?
If I only have 3 days to do this, I have to go deep undercover. I'm undercover deep now. This is deep. I'm going deeper. I don't want no more money or nothing, but I'm going deep, 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 deep undercover. So you sign that for me, and I'm going so deep, sir, you not even know where people going to try to page me. Excellent. No answer, because I'm going to be deep undercover.
I'm tired of your bullshit, Foley. You got 3 days. If I don't see some results by then, I'm going to grind your ass in the dog meat. You got that?
One area you worked in that I'm particularly interested in is the recruiting of undercover officers. So what do you look for? Say I'm an aspiring undercover. What do you want to know about me?
You've got to be able to communicate really well, because undercover is all about communication. It's being able to get people, you're usually offenders, and bring them on side with you so they can trust you. So then you want them to be able to trust you enough to actually spill the beans on certain issues, or to give you intelligence that leads to arrests or helps further investigations. So it's all about communication. And we used to say it's communication 101. It's not high-level communication science, but it's the things I talked about. How do you build up rapport with people? You pay attention to them. You don't intrude. You be very careful about asking too many questions. You make them feel important. And in some regards, the best undercover officers are ones that aren't too intrusive themselves in terms of their personalities or features of themselves, because to be a good undercover person, you almost have to be able to blend in the background and become part of the environment without people really caring too much about you or suspecting you. So sometimes that kind of featurelessness can also be a great asset. But good communication skills, a really stable sense of self, because as an undercover officer, you're a cop, you're still a cop, pretending to be a crook. And it is pretending. So you've got to keep your police identity and your everyday identity as being Joe Blow intact. And so when police go into deep undercover, which is really, really rare. I don't know whether New South Wales does it, but some organisations do, where you are living the life of a baddie, 24/7. You really need to watch those people, and they'll often come back, talk to their supervisors, talk to psychologists to get advice also on how to, manipulate the targets. But often normal undercover work is normally it's like a job. It's a meet the person, do the buy, do the bust, get the information, then go back, quote, a normal life. And then you go back out on the streets again, be undercover, and then come back. So they have a covert office, so generally the police don't know, other police don't know where it is, so that you go back there, you've got your sergeants, you've got your supervisors there, you've got police stuff around the place to remind you, the police weeklies and things like that. So it's a normal police office. It's just that there's no uniforms and there's nothing that identifies it as a police office. It's covert. And that hopefully will keep them connected to the fact they're cops pretending to be crooks, and don't become crooks pretending to be cops. And of course, we know there are cases where they probably have been submerged into that criminal lifestyle, and then they're probably now starting to become crooks who are now pretending that they're working for the police, but they're actually probably now working more for the crooks. So that's why that stable sense of identity is so important. And also to have people who can check in on you, whether they be supervisors or psychologists, to keep you on the straight and narrow. You also try to limit the amount of time, so that you don't have a career as a 20-year career in undercover. You might have 3 or 4 years on the street and then come back and do something else, normal policing.
It must lend itself to slightly ridiculous situations at times. I imagine, for example, if I had to, as Amelia, go and suddenly pretend I was a gangster, I'd have to learn this whole way of speaking, of holding myself that's obviously completely unnatural for me. And I imagine look, if I did it, it would just be like a terrible kind of sketch comedy. But that must happen where people are suddenly walking and going, "Hey, yo, bro, where's the gear?" Do you have role plays like that when they're learning?
When you select people to do undercover jobs, then you probably have a variety of personalities that you've chosen, because there's some white collar undercover work that you need to do, where it's perhaps high-level drug importations and financial crimes. Then you've got the people who are probably going to be better on the street, and so you'll just look at the way they look. Some people will just look tough and mean, even as police officers, and once they grow their hair and take off their uniforms, you would probably cross the road if you saw them coming on your side of the street. So whereas others are very poised and they put on a suit and you'd buy some real estate from them. They're that convincing. So you'll pick the right types for the right kind of jobs. But a lot of role playing, and I guess there are some people who are just flexible enough to be able to do that, whereas others are really rigid, and you can almost smell their policiness coming through. Literally smell, because police have, when I was there anyway, they all have a certain type of aftershave. and I remember watching some of the undercover exercises they were doing, role playing in the community, and they were outed, so to speak, by the criminals, obviously all in role play, and they pointed at this guy and said, "You're a effing cop, aren't you?" And they say, "No, I'm not, mate, I'm not." They said, "Well, you stink like one, you smell like one, you're wearing brute," just like the cops. And look, you're wearing the black police socks too, which he was. It's all those little subtle things that some people just can't shake, whereas others are probably a little bit better of it. So those that are really happy to be able to shake all those police attributes, they're the ones you probably got to watch a little bit more closely, because they can shed that police skin very easily, but they've got to put the police skin back on again at some stage in their later career.
That's hysterical. So, especially the brute. I was about to ask you, what was the aftershave? I wonder if they still wear it. I'm going to go and sniff police now when I see them walking down the street. I do know what you mean, though, that I remember being in nightclubs in my early 20s, and, obviously people were taking drugs on the dance floor or whatever, and there'd be some guy who always had on the wrong sunglasses, like wraparound Oakleys or something, and kind of just looked completely, a little kind of bulldog in these wraparound sunglasses on the dance floor, kind of moving a bit rigidly, and you'd think, you're a cop. And then sometimes they'd come up to you and they'd go, not that I was dealing, but they would come up to you and try you. They go, "Hey, can I buy some ecstasy?" And you go, "No, you're a cop, go away." Not that I was selling. Anyway.
Those ones you were probably seeing there were probably not in the full-time undercover section, because there were quotes part-time undercover people who were trained, but they'd just be attached to a police station, and they might go out and do a few of that sort of bit of work at night time. But the full-time undercover unit, they were there, and they were probably a little bit more sophisticated, I think, in terms of their role playing. But I exactly what you're saying, they're just emanating that policiness they can't shake.
David worked with the New South Wales Police in the late 80s and early 1990s. It was an era that would later become famous for its corruption and Wild West ways. Crooked detective Roger Rogerson was in his heyday, and in many ways law enforcement became the most lawless place of all. Some of the murders and double dealings were so outrageous, there was even a TV drama called Blue Murder made about the period.
In Blue Murder, the actor Richard Roxburgh plays Detective Sergeant Roger Rogerson with a convincing mix of Dirty Harry and the Terminator.
Were there many instances where cops like Rogerson turned to the dark side and would turn on their own potentially?
Yes, Rogerson was probably a figure who did it quite completely. In other words, it was almost now his full-time role was to become a crook. Whereas others had probably dipped their feet into the criminal world at some time, but then they come back and they become normal police. And, and it sometimes it's smaller scale corruption, which is probably the real problem within the police, where people might turn the blind eye or might go into a premise and steal something when a break and enter happens. Break and enters happen into a shop, a lot of stuff stolen, so you might as well take a few things and put it in your pocket. And there were stories where young police officers would come back to the station and their locker had some valuable in it that was from the premises, and the whole notion was, we're all in this together, we're all accepting it, no one breaks ranks, you're in it too, because you've also got the property, so, watch out. And so that's that small-scale corruption, I think, or turning blind eyes to stuff, and then, maybe being violent towards people to get them to confess or to comply, knowing that they're not going to take it any further. So the Royal Commission in the 90s, late 90s, revealed a lot of corruption, but it was mostly it wasn't Roger Rogerson scale stuff. It was probably greedy police officers or frustrated police officers or burnt out police officers, or some of them might have been just a bit arrogant police officers who thought they knew better. There's been a few like that, but that have been big time, but most of them have been small time. But that's just as bad for justice. It means you can't trust what goes to court, or you can't trust that a police officer will deal with you in a just way. I mean, most of them will, but when you see those instances of corruption, it really sours the community's perception. But unfortunately, the Rogersons become the pin-up boys for corruption, but they're not the norm.
One of the famous cases that showed just how out of control corruption had got in the police was the shooting of drug detective Michael Drury. Drury was an undercover drug squad officer who was shot twice through the window of his Chatswood home in 1984. His wife and new baby were home at the time. Crooked cop Roger Rogerson was charged over the shooting, along with two criminals, Chris Rent-A-Kill Flannery and Alan Williams. It was alleged Rogerson had tried to bribe Drury to change his evidence in the heroin trial of drug dealer Alan Williams. When Drury refused, it was claimed Rogerson hired a hitman to shoot him, but Rogerson was acquitted. And after 15 days in a coma, Michael Drury lived to tell the tale. He's someone David got to know well during his time with the cops.
He implied that of those undercover people that preceded him, 50% were kind of mad or had gone bad. So he was very keen about selection to make sure the right people were there. He was keen to get us involved in some of the training exercises to be able to give some feedback to people and to monitor them on a 6-monthly basis, to bring them into the office and say, how are you going? What's happened? Had some highlights, had some lowlights. What are your stressors? What do you find hard to cope with? What do you hope to do once you leave the undercover section? To get them thinking always forward. Most of the time, the big trouble they deal with is boredom. Because with undercover, there might be 10% of the time is on the street doing exciting stuff. A lot of the stuff is just waiting back at the office, waiting to be called or waiting for a meet or waiting for something to happen. So the smart ones would probably end up doing a degree. They've got a lot of an online degree or something like that, so they could actually get some qualifications to help them further their careers, because they're not going to be there for 20 years. They're only going to be there for 3, 4, 5 years at the most.
A desperate search for 20 people after a landslide buries 2 ski lodges in the Snowy Mountains village of Thredbo.
Wednesday, July 30, 1997, the earth gave way. Triggered by leaking water mains, mud thundered down the steep slopes of the Thredbo ski resort.
Just before midnight, a freak landslide picked up a chalet, sweeping it onto a lodge where senior Thredbo staff were sleeping.
Also tonight, the triumph of tireless rescuers who refused to abandon hope.
A miracle has occurred and signs of life were detected. Some muffled sounds from under the slab.
With the police, you're often called to emergency situations to help provide psychological support, and one of them you were called to was the Thredbo landslide. What's the role of a psychologist in such a massive disaster?
We call it on-scene support. So we don't actually do treatment, we don't counsel people, we don't pull them aside and say, you know, how is this impacting on you? It must be dreadful. Because as an emergency service worker and a rescuer, they could be there for 2-3 weeks. So you don't want them to start thinking about how am I reacting, because that might unravel the whole deal psychologically. But what you're there, you're watching. So you'd be seeing if anyone looks like they're getting a bit wobbly, or you're there if they want to talk to you. And most of our approach was we would talk to people who are the rescuers or the emergency service workers and just say, what do you do? I'm really interested. What role have you done? Or what are you doing? And, you know, and so they'll talk quite happily. Oh, I did this, I did that. And then from that, you know, if they're having a good time, and a lot of rescuers have a good time at a disaster because that's what they're trained to do. It's the kind of the A-grade game. They've been called to at last. So a lot of them aren't feeling dreadful about it. But some of them who might be sort of saying, you know, I looked at the eyes of the family member that was standing by the site, and then I realised that, you know, what I was doing, and, you know, they start to become touched, or reminded me of my mother. They become touched, and then you wouldn't dig deep, but you might just let them muse on it for a while. But you don't dig deep when someone's mid-operation. That's actually like someone's just had an operation. It's like taking the bandage off and undoing the stitches and just having a look what's inside. Not good. So, yeah, on-scene support. Now, at that time, we were there for the emergency service workers, in particular the police. But interestingly, it was one of the first operations where the police, fire brigade and the SES worked together as little teams, whereas in the past they used to compete with each other and often tread on each other's toes. So each little team had one of each in there. So that was a good strategy. So we were there to support anyone that wanted to talk, basically. But then there were a whole lot of family members of the supposed victims turned up to Thredbo, just waiting. And don't forget, it took up to 2 weeks to extract all the bodies. And so they were just hanging around, nothing to do, and then they started to get critical of the rescuers, saying they're not doing enough. You know, people heard cries, why aren't you going in there? Why aren't you digging it all up now? Because they knew that if they started digging it up, if there were survivors, they'd probably die through, you know, more concrete falling on them. The hillside might fall a bit further because it was a landslide, so you've got to secure that. So they were going very, very carefully, and they didn't want any rescuer to be injured. That's primary number one now. Okay, rescue the survivors, if there are any. There was one, Stuart Diver. But do not have any other casualties. But the public don't understand or even agree with that. They think, you know, you've just got to dig like crazy until you find somebody. So a lot of criticism there. So we suggested to the management there of the site to say, you need to have briefings twice a day with the family members about what is happening, why you're doing what you're doing, you know, what is the strategy, what is your approach, and also we could help provide some support to them as well. There was Salvation Army there, and I think there's some other disaster psychologists had flown down from, you know, other organisations. But the idea was to give them information so that they would accept what was happening. Acceptance is always the big trick. If you want people to be on your side, they've got to accept that what you're doing is the best interest. So we also got specialists because they pulled out a whole lot of geologists, concrete, rescuers, you know, survival technique, special dog people, you know, geologists, water specialists, because there's a lot of water coming down as well. That's why it came loose. Scientists, and they'd give diagrams and pictures to say why we're doing what we're doing. It was really successful, if you want to call it that, in terms of keeping the family members on side there. So that was an additional kind of support role that we did. The difficulty with traumas is that a lot of people, I don't talk about trained people like us, but will approach disaster sites and say, I'm a specialist in trauma debriefing, when they're not. And so you've also got to be part of our job was to be able to tell the management there, these people are probably kosher because I know them, they've got good credentials, yes. These people I've never heard of, they're probably just rubberneckers wanting to come in and have a look what's happening. So you've got to be careful about protecting victims from do-gooders, so to speak. And that's the other part of management of sites there. Also, not only managing the police or the rescue workers while they're at the job, but also to manage them while they're off the job. And there was one police officer in particular who, on his time off, his hours off, he'd be just standing at the site, watching, because he couldn't detach himself from the progress. So I remember we said to him, he said, look, it's snowing up there. Thredbo management had given them all free chairlifts. Go up there, make a snowman, take a photo of it, bring it back and show us. That was a joke, but in other words, get away, do something different. The other thing, after work, police officers hang around pubs, and the Thredbo Alpine Hotel, I think it's called there. They were talking, all the rescuers were talking about what they were doing, and they were probably talking in indiscreet ways. There were family members probably listening. There were journalists listening as well. So our other advice was you need to give these rescue workers some safe space where they can let their hair down, say what they like, but not be intruded by the public.
After the emergency situation was over, David ran debriefing sessions around the country with police.
We did some more in-depth debriefings where we went around the whole countryside, because don't forget, Thredbo pulled from all stations, all the trained rescue people from around the state. So we went around, and then we did, quotes, in-depth debriefings where we actually got them to talk about their experiences. What were the good parts? What weren't the good parts? And you have to remember that not everyone has a bad experience at a trauma. So you're trying to pull out what were the positives of this trauma? What did you learn? What will you take away? Because some of them felt, I did some really good job. Don't tell me I should be feeling bad. So as psychologists, you have to always approach the resilience component of it, that this has been a life-affirming event for you. Okay, X number of people died, but you did a really good job. And that's important.
David has worked at the coal face of forensic psychology, both in the prison system and with the police. There's no doubt he would have seen and heard some tough things, but as you can probably tell by listening to him, he's got a great sense of humour and plenty of sparkle. So much so that when I asked him to participate in a game show quiz about his work, he was more than happy to give it a crack.
All right, time for our psych test. From your perspective, the most interesting kind of criminal is
the psychopath, because they will probably do things that, quotes, non-psychopaths will never do.
The scariest type of criminal is
probably the psychopath.
The one thing you never do in prison is
fall in love with a prisoner. It has happened, and there are some quite notable cases too.
Most serial killers are
normal. By that I mean that you can't look at them and distinguish them amongst a crowd, but it's that small component of their mentality, their psychology, that makes the difference.
Most rapists
have very distorted cognitive thinking sets that in some regards justifies it as okay.
The best thing about being a forensic psychologist is
you never have a boring day and you have lots and lots of laughs.
The worst thing about being a forensic psychologist is
there isn't a worst part, and that's actually probably makes me sound very twee.
The funniest thing that's ever happened to you on the job is
went to the wrong house of a police client. I'd written down the wrong address, knocked on the door, turned up, told them I was from police psychology, and they invited me in, sat me down. And then it was only after 5 minutes of chat they realised I was supposed to be next door.
I like that they invited you in.
People are very compliant. All you got to do is mention police. They'll do anything.
Forensic psychologists aren't renowned for their fun reputations, but David Mutton is as lively and interesting as they come. These days, he's working as an academic at the University of Western Sydney, helping train a new generation of forensic psychs. Make sure you tune in for our final episode of Twisted Minds, where you'll get to meet Steve Longford, a former detective and criminal behaviourist. Put it this way, when a serious crime happens and a bad guy's on the loose, it's Steve you want on the case. It was his job to get inside the minds of the most dangerous crims and give the cops the jump on how to catch them. See you then.